Hi, and welcome to Santa Barbara Newsmakers. I'm your host, Jerry Roberts. Today's program is part of our special series of interviews with the candidates to be Santa Barbara's next mayor. Our guest today is former Mayor Hal Conklin. From 1977 and 1993, he served 4 terms on City Council, helping to foster the Santa Barbara of today. After election as mayor in 1993, however, a legal challenge over term limits forced him out of City Hall. Since then, he's remained very active in public affairs and now is attempting a political comeback. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So the last time you were elected mayor, and you were elected mayor in 1993, did not end well. You resigned because there was a court case. The state Supreme Court refused to review a lower court ruling that your election violated the city's term limits law. What's different now?
Well, first of all, I'd been on the council when we wrote the term limit law, which is the ultimate irony of the whole thing. And our goal was to have an opening for diversity of people to run by causing people to have a break, because we had a lot of long-term council members, including myself. I don't think any of us thought when we wrote it that it would be retroactive in the way the court read it. But, even though the city council and myself personally disagreed with the court, it went to the court, and the court ruling stands. So it was the city that was handling the court case. I was the one who was just going to be affected by it. And by the end of 1994, the Court of Appeals had ruled that the city had erred in its interpretation of term limits, and it was then appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided not to rehear it, but to allow the Court of Appeals decision to stand. So at that point, I stepped down and stayed actively involved in the community, but there was nothing that precluded me from ever running again.
And in fact, we were talking before, nobody has a copy, apparently, of this decision, perhaps except yourself. But there's a very interesting.
Yeah, people ask me all the time about it. And I go, well, actually, if you just look at the court case from 1994, the argument the city was making was that the court was precluding me from holding an office I had never held. Right. And they said, well, that's not necessarily true. We're going to rule on the issue of whether there were 4 terms that you served, and is that the total amount you can serve? But then they concluded with this final sentence, which I thought, I love the fact that it begins with the words, of course. It just says, after all this about term limits, it says, of course, Section 500, which is the term limit section, does not prevent Mr. Conklin from running for the office of mayor at any time in the future.
Period.
End of period. That's just it. So it's like, all right. They just said it right out in the court case. And
well, I'm not going to spend any more time on that thing, because it does. I mean, it's pretty determinative, the language.
Yeah, so when the city attorney looked at it, he goes, well, that's pretty clear. You can run. So,
all right, well, when you're running this time, you state on your website, I've spent the majority of my life standing up for our community values. And that's a word that you use a lot. I think a lot of people have read your film reviews on the popular Cinema in Focus
hey, thank you for the plug.
column, a spiritual social commentary, you call it. Writing from a Christian worldview, we are primarily concerned about the social and spiritual values being presented. You're a national leader in your church. I think the president of the board of administrators, or at least you were. So I want to talk a little bit about how do you balance your public values, the community values, as a public servant, as a public leader, with your personal values, and particularly on some of these very controversial social issues, such as gay marriage, abortion, creationism versus evolution, those things, where the doctrine of your church is pretty conservative, but here's a town that's pretty liberal on all those issues. How do you, I'm just to talk about how do you balance those things?
Well, and having come from a fairly liberal background, it's probably even more ironic that I would end up being in that role with the Methodist Church. Look, the issues a city council has to deal with have to do with vision about where the city's going to go, about providing services, basic services, everything from water to police, fire, et cetera. And it has to do with what the long-term provisions are for economic development, for social concerns that the city has to deal with, such as homelessness, et cetera. But the fundamental rule that the city lives under is the rule of law. So whatever the law is, that has to be protected. So we don't debate the issues of abortion or debate the issues of gay marriage or any of those things. If the law says this is what the law allows, then we have to protect people's rights to do that. And regardless of whatever position I have on any issue, if the law allows for something to happen, I feel a fundamental responsibility to make sure that people live under that law and don't violate that law for civil rights, and that they have the freedom to be able to live under the law as the law calls for.
But as you know, the council does debate national issues, or at least pass
They
resolutions.
like to, and they love to debate.
And pass resolutions about them.
Yeah, sometimes it's like that old adage about, it wouldn't be such a big issue if the issue, wasn't so small. It's like when it comes to the issues of what the city can do, these are small issues. When they come to the issues of social concern for the people, they're big issues. But the council's decisions have little to do with it, other than just symbolism.
So if I hear what you're saying, and I just want to be clear, you're saying you would put aside, should there be an issue that came, for example, what if there was a resolution about physician-assisted suicide? Because it's still a controversial issue in California, and the council was going to vote on a resolution of that. How would you deal with that? Would you put aside your own views, or would you weigh in?
If it's an issue that is going, let's say the legislature was going to pass something, and somebody wants us to take a stand on it. My position is, I don't care whether it has to do with environmental issues or human issues or legal issues related to assisted suicide. If it's something the city has control over and can ultimately be under its domain, then we should take a position on it. If it's just having to respond to what our personal feelings are as a community to a social issue, then I think that those social issues ought to be addressed by organizations that relate to those social issues. And the city council doesn't relate to those issues. It's just a public forum for debate.
One more point on this. The doctrine of the Free Methodist Church, at one point at least, said that labor unions, as generally constituted, are secret societies, and membership therein is a bar to membership in the church. Is that still the? That's been tossed out.
That was in the 19th century.
Well, it's actually in the 20th century, but
it may have lasted to the 20th century,
but that's gone. I just want to clarify that.
No, I'm a big supporter of unions, so I don't.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about some housing issues. Randy Alcorn, a friend who writes op-eds for Newshawk, recently wrote about housing. He writes, there is no housing crisis in Santa Barbara, and there is no shortage of affordable housing. What there is are too many people who want to live here for a price they can afford. And there are the forces of greed all too eager to profit by building a few affordable units along with many more market rate units. Do you think there's a housing crisis in Santa Barbara?
It's interesting, and today, I don't know what day this is going to show, but in today's Los Angeles Times,
August 24th.
Today, on the August 24th issue of the LA Times, there's a front story on the housing crisis of California. And it somewhat takes the same position, which is that it's the land cost and the demand for people who want to take advantage of coming and living on that land is so big that it just drives the price up and up and up. And it compared the average housing cost in San Francisco, which was $1.4 million for a unit, to Los Angeles, which was $566,000 on average, to the lowest, which was Riverside County at around $265,000. What it was showing across the board is that the land cost driven by competition for people who want to live on certain parts of that land, which drive the cost up. Now, in Santa Barbara, this is no consolation to anybody who wants to live here, but Santa Barbara as a city actually has more government-controlled housing than almost any city of its size in America. 10% of all the housing in Santa Barbara is controlled by
public housing.
Is controlled by the government, either Section 8 or housing authority housing or restricted housing in some kind of way under the zoning laws, the way it was built. That's still a drop in the bucket of what people want who want to come here.
And there continues to be pressure for the city government to do more about producing a so-called affordable housing. The average unit size density program, the AUD, which has been in effect, has been producing more rental housing, but not what anybody by any stretch would call affordable, given the $3,000 a month rents.
Well, and I've watched and participated in everything from Habitat for Humanity to to our own housing authority building projects. And certainly when I was on the council, the redevelopment agency put a lot of money into housing. And I'm for trying anything and everything.
So you support the program?
I definitely support the program, but I think the city has to be very actively involved in how it gets implemented. You can't take a hands-off, laissez-faire attitude and just say, hey, we'll come back in a couple of years and sort of evaluate how it's going. Where the density is needed is as close to where the jobs are as possible. So probably, in all likelihood, the first place you'd want that density is in the downtown area. Or somewhere near where people don't have to use transportation to get to where it is they need to work. But it's also going to be housing that the largest part of it is for people who need to work there, not for $3 million condos.
Well, what about the rents, though? I mean, how do you think that the city should be involved in assuring that there are affordable, moderate rents?
Well, there's only so much you can do without the voters authorizing something like that. But, unfortunately, one of the things that is just a fact of life, and probably you and I are in the same boat, is that if you can get into Santa Barbara in the housing market at a cost whatever cost you can afford, my guess is that 5 or 10 years down the line, you're going to reap whatever that benefit is from that increased value of that house. You're not necessarily going to, I don't know a single friend of mine, let alone someone who's not a friend of mine, who's willing to say, well, yeah, I bought my house for $95,000 and it's now worth $1 million, so I'll sell it for $500,000 so that people can have a chance.
Split the difference, yeah.
It's like, no, they end up taking the value themselves. And every time we have written down a price on a piece of property where we helped somebody and they wrote it down and they said, well, we'll restrict it for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. 15 years goes by in a flash. And then somebody takes advantage of the increase and they reap the benefit, and then the next person can't afford to rent it. So I think that to the degree to which you can cause the building cost to be as low as possible by helping to partner with the developer to do it, either in the write down of the cost of the land, or in terms of speeding up the approval process, or in terms of just making sure that
but there's obviously
there's
still
density.
This tension between protecting neighborhoods the way they are and increasing affordable housing. And I think, in the first run out of the AUD there, I think there was a lot of surprise about how many units were being, how many were approved, how big they were, and so on. And so they put a cap on it. So do you agree with that? Do you agree that was a good idea to cap it at 250 a year, 250 units a year?
Well, we don't ever build 250 units a year. We haven't so far, so it's not.
Well, we're getting there.
So maybe it's possible, but frankly, I don't know that the number of units are as important as where the units are.
Okay.
So I think that when the city, for whatever reason, it probably was a good idea when they thought about it, but by taking a hands-off approach, and then the first projects that get built are on Outer State Street and they're expensive, units, it's like, the people who thought, well, are we going to get worker housing out of this? They're going, that's not worker housing.
Right.
And so then what ends up happening is a good program potentially has the potential of having the baby thrown out with the bathwater because people get all upset about it. So if you want to have specific projects in specific places that help where the jobs are and having housing next to it, then the city's got to be an active participant in making that happen.
So more active than it's been on that.
Exactly.
All right. So we talk about the AUD. Let's talk about the ADU, the accessory dwelling unit program, the granny units, which is mandated by the
state law. State law.
But what can the council do, if anything, and what would you as mayor do or propose to ensure that granny units don't overwhelm neighborhoods, as some people are very concerned about?
Well, they should be concerned about it, but it is state law, so there's only certain things you can do. They have to make sure that it doesn't cause health or welfare or overburden the traffic intersections in particular areas. And that's about your only zoning controls that you can put over it. But I think that it's kind of a work in progress, and I'm watching the commissions as they go through debating it, and nobody has there's no silver bullet here. There's no easy answer. They just got to look at trying it out in a couple of different ways and see what actually happens. But that's risky because, if it doesn't work right, people are going to get really upset that they've overwhelmed their neighborhood. But it is state law, so we don't have any choice in the matter. You got to find some way to make something work. And let's try it out and just see what we can do in the first year or two, and then if it has to be ratcheted down, then we got to figure out some way to ratchet it down.
What about vacation rentals? There's a fair amount of outrage among some property owners that they're not allowed to now rent a room or another unit in their home out for a vacation rental. Do you think that's a proper use of the power of the city to crack down on that?
I know it's a big issue all over the country, let alone here. I'm surprised how big an issue it is everywhere. I frankly, when I first heard about it, thought, is this a tempest in a teapot? I don't understand why this is such a big issue. But when I listened to all the debate at the city council, and I went down and listened to it because I was very interested in it, I was surprised at how many houses had been bought up in Santa Barbara and actually converted into full-time
short-term
rentals. And I go, well, that's an obvious, huge impact on the housing market in Santa Barbara and in the activities in that neighborhood. I have a house literally within a stone's throw of my own house that somebody bought and turned into a full-time place.
So you think, unlike the people who would like to continue to be able to do this, that this is really taking units that otherwise would be available for long-term rentals off of the market?
I'm not in favor of taking any units off the market to convert them to essentially commercial uses.
But like this guy Max Mironoff, who's been doing it for years, nobody complained. He went through all the hoops that were required of him to get the permit, and the city council just threw it out. No, so you can't do that. So you can take a pretty hard line on this. You really think that that's not a good idea?
Well, I'm not in favor of converting housing units to full-time rentals. I do think that there's some compromise in if it's your own house and you want to rent out a room for a certain number of weeks or months a year, you should have the right to do that. But where all that balance is, I've seen where the council's come down on it. And
it doesn't seem there's a lot of balance right now.
I may make different choices about what that line is, but I know there's a lot of people who live around me who frankly couldn't even afford their own house if they didn't rent it out periodically. So I don't think that it's fair to those people that they can't even actually own their house if they can't figure out some way to make it work.
We're going to put you down as being open-minded enough to take a second look at this thing.
I'm open to it as long as they own or live in the house. I'm not in favor of it.
Right.
They're turning a house into a hotel.
And that's what we're talking about. Let's talk about State Street a little bit. How would you describe the current economic and physical conditions of downtown State Street?
Well, I've watched State Street over all my lifetime go through cycles, and those cycles last maybe 20, 25 years. I was involved in the 80s when we built Paseo Nuevo. I was on the committee to design Paseo Nuevo, and it was a big change from the sort of ghost town that had been created in the 70s as people were moving retail out of town. It used to be Sears downtown, there used to be Montgomery Ward's downtown, there used to be Penny's downtown, they all left. And downtown was literally turning into a ghost town. I remember my aunt saying to me one day, "Don't be caught downtown after 6 o'clock because you'll
fall asleep.
You'll either fall asleep or get mugged." And so what we saw was a systematic designing over time of a nightclub district, of a retail district, of a cultural district, of a waterfront district, and all of that was very successful for a cycle. Now, you're certainly seeing some impact from the amortization of
retail.
Retail has changed dramatically. when I see projects that cities downtown that are working, they have a lot more people living downtown. If you go to the Americana project in Glendale, you have 1,000 people that have moved into the downtown shopping area, and it becomes a 24-hour living area as well as shopping area. And I think that that has a very positive impact, and it's probably one of the things that Santa Barbara needs to seriously consider. The other is that you have both ends of the spectrum on people renting properties. People who have upped the rents so ridiculously because they just kept thinking it was going to get more and more and more retail coming in, that you see boarders and everybody else moving out because they can't possibly afford those rents. And on the other hand, you got people who have owned the properties for so many years that sometimes they just leave them sit empty for 5, and in one case, 10 years now. And I think that if you're going to leave a property vacant on State Street, I'd give them 90 days to do something about it. And if they don't, either put some kind of display like from the Art Museum or from a nonprofit organization in the window, or we'll put a charge on you for letting the homeless sleep in your doorway, and we'll give the money to the homeless shelters.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, isn't the biggest problem we have down there aggressive panhandling and vagrancy? I mean, you've talked about the decline of retail, and that's a huge issue.
It's the one that gets a lot of attention, and boy, I've lived through that my entire life. I like the police department's approach that they took on Milpas Street, where they really said, look, all the women and children, people are down on their luck. There's a lot of programs to help them and get them off the street. The mentally ill, which comprise anywhere from 35 to 45% of the people on the street, you got to have a greater impact or partnership with county mental health and other organizations to deal with those issues. But the issue that causes the biggest problem are people aggressively panhandling.
Able-bodied males.
Able-bodied males. Now, I have a son who helped run a program for lots of people who were addicts in this county, and he told me once, he says, Dad, when I was young, I gave money to everybody on the street. He says, after running this program and after witnessing the change in people's lives, he said, the amount of enabling that goes on in this community to help people stay on drugs and alcohol by giving them money is a medical tragedy.
So what can the council do about that?
And so what the police have done, like on Milpas Street, is that they've really worked with the property owners to educate their clients who come in the door, which are more local than they are downtown, to not give money to people on the street because you're just enabling digressive and disabling behavior.
So would you as mayor propose a more aggressive approach to this problem than we're taking now?
Yeah, I would. And although I have to say the downtown organization has done a pretty good job, and the police have done a great job of bringing additional people besides officers on the street to try and discourage people from giving money. The hard part is that you got a lot of tourists that come to State Street, and they just hand out money left and right. So you really have to actively pass out materials, talk to the property owners, talk to the shopkeepers, and get people to stop enabling bad behavior.
All right, we got about 3 minutes, and I want to cover a couple of things real quickly. The sales tax. Do you support the 1 cent sales tax increase that's going to be on the ballot?
I support it, and I think that it's a good idea. I do think there needs to be a parallel ordinance for accountability about how you spend that money.
How are you going to ensure that it's spent on public?
If I had been on the council, I would have proposed that we put it on the ballot so there's a voted on it point of accountability. But there are other cities that very carefully put in accountability every 90 days for a whole list of projects that the voters have approved over the years. Because people will remember what they did last year, maybe even 3 years ago, but they don't remember what they did 5 or 10 years ago. But that money's still being spent. And so some cities, and I think this city should do this, should have an accountability ordinance which says that every 90 days it reports to the community and to any public group that wants to have them come and speak to it, a list of all the projects that have been approved in the city.
You don't think that there's that kind of accountability built into the structured in
I think
now?
it's inside City Hall, but the average citizen on the street doesn't know what that means. And they're the ones who have to vote to whether to pass this or not, and they don't trust government in general.
All right, we've got a $250 million unfunded liability for pensions. City's tried some modest proposals. You got any big ideas on what to do about that?
Man, if somebody had a big idea, I'd be governor.
All right, how about a medium idea?
Well, Unfortunately, I think it does require, and this is what's ended up having to happen, is a two-tiered system of way pensions get paid
Right.
for. And I think it's a 20-year solution. There's no 1 or 2 year solution to this. So, well, once again, I think you have to have some form of accountability of saying, even if it's 20 years, every year is how are we doing to make sure we're on track to get that done.
That's a big one. That's going to be huge. All right, final question. I just want to ask you about Senate Bill 54, the so-called sanctuary state bill, which would extend to all of California many of the protections for immigrants that already exist in so-called sanctuary cities. Our sheriff, Bill Brown, is the head of the Sheriff's Association for the state. They're vehemently against this. Do you support that bill? Do you support a sanctuary state?
Well, I've been watching as it's going through the legislature, and I can see why it's had trouble getting approval, even from all the Democrats, because there are some key provisions in it that I know the sheriff has made a big deal about, which is that if there are certain crimes, such as attempted rape or a variety of other things, which you can't report on, that's a problem. So I think that there's a core to that bill which has value, but you got to work out the devil's in the details, and you. So
you're against it as of now, as of
I think
today.
that it's got to get amended so that some of these key provisions of criminal behavior are reportable.
But you think, as a general principle, that local law enforcement should not be cooperating too closely with the federal immigration authorities?
I think the police chief and the police department already has taken a very good stand in Santa Barbara. I mean, it focuses on local laws and doing what you have to do locally. It doesn't go out of its way to pretend to be federal agents. But I think that if you're asked by the federal government, the only thing you should be reporting on is criminal behavior.
All right. Well, I wish we had more time, but I know you'll come back, right, during the campaign. Well, thanks very much, Hal Conklin, for being with us, and we hope you'll come back. And thanks to all our loyal viewers for checking in online or TVSP's Channel 17. You can check out our complete set of interviews with the mayoral candidates on YouTube and find that at newsmakerswithjerryroberts.com. And look for the return of our Newsmakers panel of journalists starting September 7th. Thanks to our director, Oscar Gutierrez, our crew, Mark, Anthony, Kendrick, and Ken, our marketing director, Maggie Mabuchi, our legal advisors, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, and as always, our senior high-ranking, all-powerful chief executive producer, Hap Freund. Thanks for watching Newsmakers. We'll see you again.